Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Alrighty, on today's episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, we're going to be continuing our conversation on nitrogen.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. Yeah, in part two, we're going to talk a little bit about nitrogen and its forms, and also about nitrogen a lot more. We talked about ammonium on our last podcast. This one will be more extensive on the nitrate fraction of that nitrogen. Anyway, I'll just start off a little bit. I talked a little bit about anhydrous ammonia and its 82% concentration and kind of how it was put together. But the other principal forms of nitrogen that you can utilize are urea, which is used a lot, and it's moved a lot too, and across the U.S. from nitrogen manufacturers, and it's a 46% nitrogen, and it's considered what they call organic nitrogen, because the true words of organic means carbon-based. And real simply, not to get too specific, but you inject carbon dioxide into a tower with anhydrous ammonia as you inject that in, and as it goes up it forms a solid urea, which is a carbon-based nitrogen, and then it falls down from gravity and you basically have urea, and it's both in the granular and pearl form. But anyway, it's a good solid nitrogen. Its problem being it's very, very hygroscopic, which means it seeks water, and the other part is if it gets moisture and it's out in the open, it'll basically release off anhydrous ammonia as it stabilizes a little bit, and basically you're going to lose your nitrogen. So a lot of times it needs to be incorporated into the soil as soon as possible and wet down if that's also possible. So, but urea, it's a great product in a lot of cases because of the high concentration of nitrogen, and you get a lot of nitrogen for, in that, say 100 pounds, you got 46 pounds. That's really good. Then you have ammonium nitrate. It's a 34% nitrogen. You don't see much of it anymore. It's got some bad baggage as being explosive under certain conditions, so we don't see a lot of it in the marketplace much anymore. But it was a really nice nitrogen product because it was half ammonium and half nitrate, and as I was talking about, you had the ability to have both at the same time, so it was a really nice product, but we don't see too much of it anymore. Then we have UAN, or urea ammonium nitrogen, or UN32, or it used to be called Trian for the three types of ammonia, three types of nitrogen that it has. It has about a fourth nitrate, a fourth ammonic, and 50% in the urea form. It's a stabilized urea, and so it gives you three forms of nitrogen and a pretty good concentration at 32%. Very easy to handle, works really well. And it's probably one of the building blocks anybody that's using liquids in their nitrogen program. Then you have an Aqua-Ammonia, something that we don't see a lot of use, but it's still used in a lot of places, but we don't see like we used to. And that's basically reacting water and forcing it together with anhydrous ammonia, and you get a 20% Aqua-Ammonia with 100% ammonium-based nitrogen, but you do get a lot of free ammonia coming off of it, so not really easy to handle, and it's only, again, got 20% nitrogen. Then you got one of my personal favorites, ammonium sulfate, because I'm getting a big bang of sulfate at 24% with that ammonium nitrogen. Another thing about it, it's basically put together with anhydrous ammonia as the building block of most of these, and sulfuric acid, and that's how you're getting your ammonium sulfate derived. Then you got your two phosphates, got a little bit of nitrogen in them. You got DAP, or diammonium phosphate, which has got 18%, and then you've got a little less phosphate. It's only 46%. And then you got your MAP, or your monoammonium phosphate, which is only 11% nitrogen, but it's 52% phosphate. So it's a really good one for using in phosphate situations. You got Soda-Nitrate, which is basically sodium and nitrate, 16% nitrogen. There are some cases where your plants can actually be short of sodium, particularly in things like grains like wheat. So sometimes it's actually a good application. Most of the times we're trying to prevent sodium, so we don't see a lot of use on it. It does have some organic certification. It works, so we see a little bit of it in that situation. Potassium nitrate, and that's used a lot in solutionizing. It's really hygroscopic, goes into solution really well. It's got a 13% nitrogen, and it's got a nice potassium kick. And then there's tons of organic products, manures, fish meal and bone meal, compost, amino acids. All of these have organic nitrogen in them, normally between 1, and I have seen them up to 10-12%. Really be careful if you are an organic grower, because once you get above 8%, it's hard to get the rest of that nitrogen in there organically and really be certified. So be skeptical if you start to see real high, much above 8-9% on the nitrogen. So there's the products that you can use, and it gives you a lot of variation. But again, it kind of comes back to, what do I need and why do I need it? Next, when we lay down nitrogen, we have nitrogen fixation basically, and that's what we've done to create anhydrous ammonia. And when it gets into, and it's seeking water, so if it's in the ground and has moisture in the ground, it's going to grab some hydrogen and it's going to form ammonium, that NH4. After that NH4 is going to react with some oxygen and a bacteria called nitrous ammonius, and that'll form nitrous oxide and a little bit of water. You take that nitrous oxide with some more oxygen, and you have another microorganism called nitrobacter, and it'll basically then form you nitrate nitrogen. So, but plants take up either one, ammonium or nitrate, through their roots. And really neither one of them is appropriate for a foliar. If you're going to foliar, you need something that's a clean urea product, and that's what you really is the best. It's the most assimilated in the leaf, much greater than nitrate, much greater than ammonium. Ammonium can actually be toxic with very little effort. So, but urea works really well. And we need to keep in urea, in the formation of it, we want one that's what we call a low biuret, which makes it safer for application on tissues.
Now Bill's going to talk about why it's so important to have a properly balanced soil in order to get all the nutrients necessary into your plant.
I always like to talk about a lot of what we've talked about in previous podcasts. But when you really look at it, properly balanced soils equal greater nutrient efficiency. And properly balanced soil equal greater water efficiency. So between water getting in and nutrients getting in, they go hand in hand in that nutrient solution that we're trying to get that plant to absorb. So we got to start with balancing the soil first. There are some things that just don't change though. If you have a low exchange capacity soil, meaning very little clay, lots of sand, you're just going to need more nutrients applied more often than if you had a higher exchange or heavy clay soil, or even a moderately clay soil. So soil chemistry, for the most part, dictates how and when nutrients should apply.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about how the soil humus contributes so greatly to the retention of nutrients such as nitrogen in your soil.
Another thing I mentioned, I think earlier when we were talking about soils and what was part of their soils, is the soil humus, or that stabilized organic fraction that you get when you break down materials, carbon materials, and form these nutrients and a binding site in that carbon to hold on to not only nitrogen but other nutrients as well. And if you have a good, strong organic material or soil humus level, it will release, whether you do anything or not, every year, year after year, as long as you don't disturb it, a set amount of nitrogen. So take one soil, and it has a sandy soil, which is difficult to build up soil humus in these sands. Has a level of about 1% soil humus. Well, that's going to yield you about 40 pounds of nitrogen every season. Okay? But if you have another soil, and it has a soil humus content of about 5%, this is going to yield over 100 pounds of nitrogen per growing season. So you would understand, if we could get that, and we have a soil humus built up to 5%, we want to retain that at all costs, because you're looking at 50, 60, up to maybe 80 pounds of nitrogen that you get for free every year. That's part of your growing cycle. That's part of what you can budget it for, but you can get that. But you don't know unless you've got a good soil test to know what you can bank on in that particular part of your soil structure. And so the higher, there's a point, once you get much above 5%, the big value starts to go down, meaning we don't gain, like if we get to 10%, we're going to get 200 pounds. No, you won't. There's only so much nitrogen that's going to be held, even in these higher organic soils. But 5% would be a great goal to go for if you can possibly get there.
Now Bill's going to get into the application of nitrogen and when the proper time is to apply it and when you've already waited too long to apply it.
In terms of application on nitrogen, I would say earlier is always better. And if you're using the proper forms, as I said, on ammonic or ammonium nitrogen, if I put it out there, it's more forgiving. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to get into the plant. It's got the flexibility of going up, supplying reproductive function, coming back, converting to nitrate, and going back and giving you vegetative. But when you go earlier with that product, it's really the place it fits in your program the best. That or in areas where you need to fertilize and you think you're going to have high rainfall, ammonium always works better. You should try to keep your applications to 40 to 50 pounds maximum per application. In most cases, if you have frequent irrigations, 10 to 20 pounds would be better. And if you want to, you can actually be injecting small amounts of nitrogen every irrigation. But don't fall behind in case the demand is greater than you can get those small units of nitrogen in there at one time. Your application, because I talked about, should be no more than a month apart. Smaller crops, you can put it close. Smaller statured crops, it could be a little less frequent than that. Large crops, you need to keep that in there. And remember, you need to start early, but stop early also. Even though you're still growing your crop, think about how long that last application will be. And is it when I want that plant to senesce or start to mature its reproductive parts? Is that, make sure I'm not still trying to make it grow. If you've got young crops, like a lot of people ask me about young trees. I try to tell them, keep somewhere, if you take the amount of nitrogen that you have in your soil humus, and you need about somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen for every year that tree is in the ground, So by the fourth or fifth year, when you start to get full production, you're looking at somewhere close to 200 pounds. That first year, you're only looking at a very few pounds, because if you've got any soil humus at all, that'll really help you.
Now Bill's going to get into talking a little bit about foliar.
There's another way to apply nitrogen, and that's foliar. But you need to know why I would want to do it, and when should I do it, what type, how much, how often. And then basically what I look at as foliars for the most part are Band-Aids. They're trying to mask a deficiency in the soil that I can't correct in time for this year's crop or the next 2 or 3 years' crop. It's going to take me a while to build those nutrients up. So it's kind of to mask some deficiency. But don't be confused that you cannot add enough foliar nutrition on the larger nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, sulfur. You're not going to be able to add enough there because you just can't get the concentration high enough and get enough into the plant to actually do that. I always tell people a good way to think of it this way is they're helpers, but the pounds come from the soil. The parts per million can come from foliar application. So I always think that one of the better ways to do foliars is to look at my soil micronutrients. And if I'm particularly low on several of them, that's a good place to try to make up for it, because I don't need near as many pounds to get to that point. And if I apply them, particularly I'm able to apply them at a time that is a stressful event, or it's a time when they need more than I can probably deliver through the normal system, a really good time to put on foliars. And they can help to maximize crop productions by being able to hit those timings better maybe than we can get smaller amounts through the soil. You need to understand a little bit about your plant physiology and recognize the different stages of growth. I think you need to also utilize current cultural practices, some of the things we currently do in the way of how we apply certain products to the soil, where we can utilize something in our herbicide applications, or in our normal blast sprayer type application, or electrostatic sprayers. We can utilize things that we would normally not have a place to get them into the system. Never wait for deficiency symptoms to show up. By the time you see the deficiency symptoms, harm has been done, yield has been lost, and now you're just trying to make the best of a bad situation. So always know what you need to have ahead of time, not wait for it to tell you what you need. A lot of times at that point, tissue tests, all they tell you is, yeah, I was right, I'm low. Well, it also is too late to really affect that. You can make it look better, but that yield loss is already been achieved, and you're not going to be able to get it back. When you're doing foliars, always think that it's not just a one and done. If you want to apply them and be effective, it's a program, and multiple types of applications is going to be your best avenue to get what you need in when you need it. And last on foliars, you need to maximize the uptake. It does you no good to put on a foliar in 20-mile-an-hour wind that by the time you're 5 feet past those, it's already dried. You didn't have enough opportunity to keep that liquid area with the nutrients in contact with the leaf so that it can get back into the leaf. And so you want to maximize your uptake, so you need to do that where you can keep that water and leaf surface together for as long as possible. If you're thinking about foliars, you can use your soil test and also your tissues to kind of improve your guess. If you have some early season, the university's been doing some work on it, so it's some pretty good results to forecast what you're going to need throughout the season, and put together your program early based on what your soils and tissues say is going to be your weakest point, the lowest nutrients that you're going to need to add that. And then another thing about foliars that I used to think if I was short of one, I would put it on. But what I found is that there's a synergy when you put foliars on, and they work better in combination, and work on the plant stage of growth or reproductive growth. So, but nitrogen can be helped in certain critical times, like I say, low by urea or something that's connected with a good chelated agent can get a little bit more nitrogen in. But those are all things I think that can be helped along the way by just understanding, the old expression is you don't know what you don't know, which means if I don't have tissue samples and soil samples with which to tell people what I'm short of, how do I know actually how to guess to even get close to what I may need? Another one form of nitrogen that kind of slips up on you, and a lot of people are applying it and don't even know they're doing it and not allowing for it in their nitrogen program, is in their water. I mean, it's not unusual these days in California, but I've found it in other parts of the world, is that you've got nitrate or ammonium in that water, irrigation water that you're pumping out of the ground, and because of that, you're applying more nitrogen to the soil. So you need to count that and put it into your budget. If you need a crop that, say, takes 200 pounds of nitrogen, you're going to need to put it about 220 if you're 90% efficient, And then you look over here and see how much you are getting from your water. And then you look over here and see how much I got from soil humus. And then the rest of your nitrogen is going to have to be applied through some form, whether it be fertigation, whether it be broadcast, but you're going to need to get that up to that level of 220. And it begins on your production expectations. If you're growing corn and you want to grow 250 bushels, you're going to need about 1.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. That's about what it takes. And then you're going to need about 10% more than that, because you're going to be if you're doing good on your soil structure, you're only going to be about 90% efficient. And then on top of that, what other forms of nitrogen are available, how much soil humus, to put all your nitrogen together. The one thing I always tell people, nitrogen is fortunately something that you can adjust. If we have the wrong growing conditions, we don't have the type of crop we thought we were going to do, not by any means other than environmental things have taken effect, not enough water, not enough, too much water, it just goes on and on. You can always adjust backwards and start to back off of nitrogen as you get into the season, because most of the time those problems show up earlier rather than later, so we can begin to back off on nitrogen.
Now Bill's going to talk a little bit about the effects of calcium on nitrogen.
Also, the effects of calcium on nitrogen. I talked about soil structure and getting that 68-12 rough numbers of calcium to percent to magnesium percent, but also talked a little bit about when you have excess nitrogen in a nitrate form, because it leaches, it will remove a pound of soluble calcium for about every pound of excess nitrate that moves through the system, pound for pound. And if you're applying 100 pounds extra, you took out 100 pounds of calcium. You do that for 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden you don't have close to the soil structure, and now you're having to apply even more nitrogen. And it get into a vicious cycle of, I have to apply more to get enough in, and because I do that, I take more calcium out, and by taking more calcium out, I have to apply more nitrogen the next year until after a certain point, nothing seems to work. The magnesium gets so hard that you get very little water penetration, and you'll suffer tremendously. Because usually, almost always, when calcium gets removed off the soil colloid, it's magnesium that's right there to take its space. There are a few exceptions to that, but with maybe some really bad sodic water where you have lots of sodium in your water, and just because there's so much of it around all the time, you lose some calcium, and now your sodium percent gets up. And then you begin to get too much magnesium and sodium, and water doesn't move through. So guess what? They're hanging around. They don't leach like they normally would. And now you have an even bigger problem. Because once the pore space is reduced, water doesn't move through, microbiology gets sluggish, and eventually quits working, and everything goes in the opposite way of high production. Because less air always means less microbial activity. That microbiology lives in the aerobic zone, meaning in the presence of air. And when we start to take our calcium out because of excess nitrogen, we're going to do that and slow down our microbial activity. Less pore space means more standing water. I talked earlier about when you have standing water, you're going to find that when you have more standing water, you tend to denitrify more. And as you denitrify, you basically are going to lose that back to the atmosphere. You're going to lose nitrogen back in the form of ammonia, NH3, or even as N2. I want to talk a little bit about nitrate nitrogen.
Next up, Bill's going to talk about nitrate.
I talked about ammonium in the first part of the podcast. I'm going to talk about nitrate. Nitrate nitrogen is usually the major form that gets applied, and a lot of it is absorbed into the plant. But nitrate assimilation uses a great deal more energy to get into that plant than NH4 or ammonium. So because of that, it's good to do the nitrate, or good to apply nitrate, when your plant is really super active growing, not maybe when it's first coming up, first getting started, because it's pulling away from its ability to maybe germinate, get through the surface, start to form leaves. And so it's better to get started with maybe ammonium at that point, but not too much. Nitrate must be reduced to ammonium before it can be assimilated into organic compounds. So you really need to go back and remove that oxygen that's been on there and oxidized and reduce it back by adding hydrogen before it can really be taken into organic compounds. So if you're wanting to build soil humus, this is one factor that has to happen, because all of the nitrogen in your soil humus will be ammonium. And to assimilate it into those organic compounds that you add, you have to make sure you have a lot of the right bacteria to be able to reduce it off of nitrate back to ammonium. One of the things about nitrate too, and this happens a lot early in the season, and it goes back to why I like ammonium earlier, is uptake on nitrate is sensitive to low temperature. It's very difficult to get into it in wet conditions, in anaerobic or lack of oxygen conditions. And you get biological denitrification, and that is subject to leaching. The other thing about nitrate and ammonium that you have to understand, and I always remember to, because nitrate promotes vegetative growth, ammonium promotes reproductive growth, and also converts to nitrate and does vegetative growth also.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about why it's so important to know specifically what you are trying to accomplish with the application of nitrogen.
But remember, what am I trying to grow? If you are trying to grow a nut crop, a corn crop, a bean crop, even a wine grape crop, what you essentially are wanting your plant to grow is grow its reproductive part, Seeds of nut crops basically is its reproductive body. Even your fruits that you like to eat the flesh, but you basically, the tree basically is trying to produce the pit. Corn is trying to produce the kernels, which is its reproductive body. Beans, it's trying to its reproductive parts. All of these are. So when you're looking at that, you're not as worried about over ammonium, putting too much ammonium on these, as long as you aren't getting to toxic levels. You can put on a lot of ammonium. And the other thing about ammonium is it converts rapidly in high temperatures. Once the temperature gets over 90, somewhere around 3 to 4 days, you can convert ammonium to nitrate. So you don't get a lot of effects of ammonia once it gets hot. So most of everything you've got is going to be nitrate in those heavier. But that's your vegetative phase of the growth of almost all of these plants. But I want to grow lettuce, cabbage, any of the vegetable crops you can think of. What am I trying to grow? I'm trying to grow the vegetative part of that. So you need to be very careful at that point about too much ammonium. Because if you get to cold weather, where nitrate's difficult to get in, and you have too much ammonium out there for that plant, then what can happen is it can go reproductive, which is the last thing you want a vegetable crop to do, is because it will then bolt and try to put on seed head, which makes the head of lettuce, cabbage, those types of crops, make them not saleable. It also, as it converts, takes those sugars and carbohydrates to make that stem that's going to go up and produce the seed, basically pulls the sugars out, and you get a very either flat or bitter tasting lettuce or cabbage. So it's very important to understand, what do I want this crop to do for me? Because naturally, every crop's goal is to reproduce itself. If you go in and try to produce lots and lots of ammonia, you're going to produce a really, really big-sized pit and very small flesh. But the flesh is the saleable part, the part that we eat, the part we consume, the sugars that we want in there. So we work at building it gradually, and then we rapidly grow our flesh later in the year with nitrogen rather than, but we got to get that pit to harden off where we're not continuing to pour nitrogen into the pit and make it bigger and bigger. So think about what I want this plant to do. It's very important. I mean, you just don't treat all crops the same. Do I have a reproductive crop? Do I have a vegetative crop? That's the first thing you do. I need to be careful with ammonium. If I'm doing vegetative, I need to be a little higher on pushing ammonium if I've got a reproductive crop.
To finish off, now Bill is going to explain why it's so important to stay on top of your nitrogen application.
Few things to remember before I close about nitrogen. Almost always apply nitrogen before you believe you need it. I've explained that why, because it takes a while for it to go in and get to the growing part of that plant. You almost always need to apply multiple times, okay? I say almost always. I've had crops, and I've worked in a lot of crops over the years. One of the ones that was radishes, we were growing seed to harvest in 18 to 21 days. And at 18 days, if everything wasn't there the day they were planted, you don't have enough time to pick it up and produce it. So you needed everything in a pre-plant. Had to all be there. But most every other crop I've dealt with, you need to apply it multiple times throughout the growing season. So you're getting some in all the time. Know the best times and what type of crop you have. So whether you want to use ammonium or nitrate and how much of it you would like to do. You know, you get into cold crops. I've talked about vegetable crops that are vegetative. That's the vegetative part is the part you want to harvest. Sometimes you need a little bit of ammonia, even though it's a reproductive nitrogen, because it's the only one that can get in those colder temperatures. Nitrate's very difficult, but you need to just, give it in slowly in small amounts to keep it growing a little bit during those cold temperatures till it can get warmer temperatures and it can thrive. Always create a calcium-enriched soil of at least 60 and really more like 68 to 70% calcium for better efficiency of your nitrogen to get in. Those things are so important to understand. If we don't have the good soil structure that we talked about in previous podcasts, you're never going to realize the efficiency of nitrogen, and you're going to continue to spend more and more money as nitrogen gets more expensive, more and more on nitrogen that you could, not have to buy or apply if you had your soil structure your calcium, magnesium back at the levels you want to. Now that's 2 podcasts I've talked about nitrogen. And as we go through our series of podcasts, you'll hear me talk more and more about nitrogen at different parts and how they relate to the other nutrients. But for now, I'd like to close this one today. And hopefully you've learned a lot about nitrogen over these 2 podcasts. And if you've got questions, we're always looking for more in our mailbag. And soon I think we'll be putting together a mailbag to answer some of those questions. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Until next time, this is Bill Brush.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. That concludes our 2-part series on nitrogen. I hope you all enjoyed very much what Bill had to say about nitrogen and its various forms. Be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more episodes to come. And last but certainly not least, always stay curious.